Hello everyone and welcome back. I just wanted to wish you Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in case if I don't make a new video soon. My only wish for a new year is for 2019 to be a good year for everyone. 2018 wasn't a good year for me. I lost someone I loved very much and I had to move to a different city, but I'm trying to leave everything behind and I am hopeful that 2019 will be a good year. So yeah, today I have 3 scary Christmas stories for you and I hope you like them. So yeah. Oh, I almost forgot. Grab your flashlight and follow me into the darkness. It was Christmas Eve, and an 11-year-old French girl named Juliette was decorating the Christmas tree. Her mother was working as a nurse at the local hospital, and the two of them lived alone in the small apartment in the suburbs of Paris. Late that evening, Juliette's mother called to say she would not be home until late that night. Juliette continued to decorate the tree with all of the lovely things her mother had bought at the shop. She draped some multicolored Christmas lights around the tree and hung beautiful ornaments on the branches. After placing the angel on the top of the Christmas tree, she finally finished decorating and sat down to relax and watch TV. Even though she was all alone in the 6th-floor apartment, Juliette felt safe as she gazed across the lights of the Parisian skyline. From her window, she could see the Eiffel Tower. Most of the other tenants in the building had gone home to spend Christmas Eve with their relatives in their countryside. The apartment building was almost deserted. Juliette was growing bored, waiting for her mother to return. Suddenly, she thought she heard a scratching noise at the front door. She turned down the television and listened carefully. There was an eerie silence. Curious, she slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw a man standing outside, dressed in a red suit with fluffy white trim. He was large and fat with a dirty grey beard and wore a red hat on his head. He knocked at the door loudly. Nervous and concerned, she asked through the door, "Who's there?" "It's Santa Claus," the man replied. "Let me in. I am cold and tired and I'm hungry." At this, a chill went down Juliette's spine. She was no dummy. She knew that whoever this creepy man was, he wasn't Santa Claus. "My mother isn't home right now," she said, her voice shaking. "Please leave." Peering through the peephole, Juliette watched as the man's eyes filled with anger and his face twisted into a grimace of hate. He began knocking at the door even harder and rattling the doorknob. "It's Santa Claus, Juliette," he growled. "Have you laid out some milk and cookies for me, Juliette? You know how much Santa loves his milk and cookies." The young girl had a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. How did he know her name? Then the man began kicking and pounding at the door. She peeked out again and saw him reach into his coat pocket and pull out a switchblade. He shoved the knife into the peephole and tried to pry it open. Juliette was terrified. She didn't know what to do. "If you don't go away, I'll call the police," she shouted. All of a sudden, the knocking stopped. Juliette stood perfectly still, afraid to move. Minutes passed and she started to think that the man might have been scared away by her threat. She slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole to see if the man was really gone. The hallway seemed to be empty. Suddenly, she saw the man running down the hallway with an axe in his hand. Juliette screamed and ran to the closet in a panic. She crouched down and hid behind the coats as tears of fright rolled down her cheeks. She heard the boom, 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 as the man tried to smash down the front door. There was a mighty crack as the door gave way, and the man came crashing through the splintered wood. Laughing to himself, he called out, "Juliette, my pretty, where are you? Don't be afraid. We'll have ourselves some fun tonight. Where are you hiding?" The crazed intruder walked around the house, searching for the frightened girl. Juliette curled up in the closet, trembling with fear. She dreaded to think what he was planning to do to her. Suddenly, the handle of the closet moved up and down. Then the door began shaking, and she heard the man's voice laughing. "I know you're in there," he said. "Open up for Santa. Open up before I open you up." The man swung his axe, and it struck the closet door with a huge bang, tearing into the flimsy wood. Juliette screamed and began crying bitterly. She grabbed a wire coat hanger and twisted it into a point. She waited, her eyes open wide, and her hands were trembling. There was another loud crash, and the closet door gave way in a hole of splinters. The horrible man tore the doors off their hinges and thrust his head in between the coats. He was laughing and drooling like a madman as his huge, gnarled hands grabbed at the horrified girl. Juliette held up the pointed end of the coat hanger and bravely thrust it into the man's face. It went straight into his eye. He recoiled in pain, screaming with rage as blood flowed down his cheek. He ripped the wire out of his eye socket and grabbed Juliette by the hair. Then he dragged her, kicking and screaming, out of the closet. The man pushed her to the ground and held her tightly by the neck, leaning over her. Blood spilled out of his eye, splattering all over her face. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and he whispered in her ear, "Tonight you will be privileged, my beautiful Juliette. I've got a list and I've checked it twice. I'm here to decide if you have been naughty or nice. You can scream and beg for your life, but naughty girls get the axe and nice girls get the knife." It was after midnight when Juliette's mother returned home. She saw the front door hacked to pieces and rushed inside to look for her daughter. Gazing around, her eyes struggled to take it all in. Then she began screaming in absolute horror. The Christmas tree was decorated with Juliette's entrails, and her severed head was perched on the top. I remember that Christmas when I was 8 years old, as if it had happened yesterday. I remember how I would lie very still under the old moth-eaten quilt my mother made. I was wide awake and listening for those familiar sounds, the thump of the front door closing, the clomp-clomp of my father's mud-caked boots on the stairs, and the sound that to this day still fills me with terror. Then my father would pass by my doorway, and the light from the hallway would cast his shadow on my bedroom wall, and the shadow of the bloody axe he carried in his hands. The next morning, I would eat my watery oatmeal in my kitchen and ask my mother very slowly and carefully, "Where was Daddy last night?" She would just look at me with her sad grey eyes. I will never forget the pain and torment in those eyes, but she never said a word. After breakfast, I would set about doing the chores on our little farm. My father never did much work on the farm. You always seemed to be busy with other matters. On those chill, windy mornings, as the snow began to fall, I had a lot of time to think. At school, I could not pay much attention to my lessons. I was always lost in my own troubling thoughts. When I got home in the evening, I would arrive just in time to see my father leaving, his axe clutched tightly in his hands. I rarely saw my father during daylight hours, and at night all I ever saw was his shadow. I can still vividly recall that terrible night when I was awakened by the sound of the shutters on my bedroom window clattering in the screaming December winds. When I got up to close the shutters, I happened to glance over at the barn and noticed a shadow in the darkness. It was my father, and he was putting something into the feed box we used for the cattle. I returned to bed and lay awake long into the night, puzzled by just what I had seen. Eventually, I fell into a tortured and troubled sleep. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I took the key that hung on a hook in the kitchen and opened the feed box. I remember standing and staring for several seconds at the foul-smelling, bloody pulp inside, trying to understand why my father would put parts of a slaughtered animal into the feed box. Then I noticed something that struck horror into the pit of my soul. Justing up of the bloody offal, it was a severed human hand. From that moment, I was filled with a nameless dread. I no longer looked at my parents with trust, but with a dark, creeping suspicion. I began to notice things that had previously escaped my attention. Newspaper headlines had spoke about brutal murders and discovered bodies. Overheard conversations about a bloodthirsty man on the loose. Finally, I heard a boy at school utter two words that repeated over and over my tortured mind: axe murderer. That night, my sleep was invaded by shapeless horrors. In these nightmares, I saw two images that haunted me constantly: the face of my father and an axe dripping with blood. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed and crept downstairs. Taking my father's axe from the fireplace, I dimmed the lights and crouched into the darkness at the top of the stairs. It seemed an eternity before I heard the key in the lock and the front door swung open, then closed. I listened for those familiar footsteps on the stairs. Stepping out of the darkness, I raised the axe above my head and brought it crashing down. In the eerie silence that followed, I listened for the sound of any movement from my parents' bedroom. I hoped against hope that my mother had heard nothing. The only sound I heard was the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and the pounding of my heart. I looked for the last time at the headless body that lay crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, then quietly tiptoed back to my bed. Early the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of strange voices in our hallway. Silently, I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down at the scene below. A group of policemen were crowded around my father's bloody corpse. My mother was standing beside them, watching silently. No one was paying any attention, but when she glanced up, she noticed me. Then very briefly, she gave me a knowing wink. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martingale and found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, and the trees were leafless. There were no flowers, save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months, as she had intended. and for myself, the Cronzones were still absent in New York, where they meant to spend Christmas with old Mrs. Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martingale seemed wet enough, and the ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded the room became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became more real, also, when servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears, heard the trum-trum, the banging and the clattering which had been described to us. My dear reader, you doubtless are free from suspicious fancies. The existence of ghosts, and only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend the night, which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you are left in the dreary, desolate old country mansion, filled with the most uncountable sounds, without a servant, with none save an old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp, bang, going at all hours of the night. At first, I imagined the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons, who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhabited. But, by degrees, Claire and I came to the conclusion the visitation must be supernatural. Still, being practical people, not having money to leave, weren't now we liked. We decided to catch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire engaged in needlework, I reading with a revolver lying on the table beside me. But nothing, neither sound nor appearance, rewarded us. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter, I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch myself in the red bed chamber. Even to Claire I never mentioned my intention. About 10, tired out, we each retired to rest. Perhaps I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have pursued its way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quiet in the dark, I sat in the red room. For over an hour I might as well have been in my grave for anything I could see in the apartment. But at the end of that time, the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. I kept my watch opposite the window. Now, I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings of the bed and an antique wardrobe. Still, I sat on, but still no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching, and tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I awakened by hearing the door softly opened. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "But what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They are in the oak parlour." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but crept downstairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the open door of the oak parlour she paused, and we both looked in. There was the room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing, candles on the chimney-piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, and had wasted his substance and his health, who had been vile in the flesh Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of the man who had been missing for 41 years, 41 years that very night. He was dressed in the costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and round his wrists there were ruffles of lace. He looked like one who, having some good great party, had sat down after his return home to play cards with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and according to the fashion of his time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken only by the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified and yet fascinated by the scene which was being acted before us. The ashes dropped on the fireplace softly, and like the snow, we could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count, 52, 54, and so forth. But there was no other word spoken, till at length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win, the game is mine." Then his opponent took up the cards, sorted them in his hand, put them closer together, and flung the whole pack in his guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over of chairs, and such a noise of passionate voices that we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood. Out of the room, and tramp up the stairs of the Red Room, in a few minutes, with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he entered the room, he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of the weapons, and then he flung open the window, and after giving place for his opponent to pass out first, he walked forth into the night air, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and down a narrow winding walk to a smooth piece of turf, sheltered from the north by a plantation of young fir trees. It was a bright moonlight by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring of the ground. "When you say 3, he said at last to the man whose back was still towards us. They had drawn lots for the ground, and the lot had fallen against Mr. Lester. He stood thus, with the moonbeams falling upon him, and a handsomer fellow I would never desire to behold. 1, began the other, 2, and before our kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment, the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and when we were standing in the shadow of the fair plantation, shivering with cold and terror, I thought something. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martingale, that he had fallen not in fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a wide world, to behold the ground and trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, Such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. It was on just such Christmas that this Mr. Jeremy disappeared, remarked my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church. At first, that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when a fortnight after, the snow melted away and the fair plantation came to be examined, he confessed there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little dear space just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it by the ring of the diamond buckles and the sparkling breast pin, and Mr. Cronson, who is in his capacity, came over to inspect these relics. Did you in your dream see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman opponent? No, I answered. He sat and stood with his back to us all the time. There is nothing more, of course, to be done in the matter, observed Mr. Cronson. Nothing, I replied. And there the affair would doubtless have determined, but that a few days afterwards, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips, and exclaiming, "Look, John, there he is!" rose from her seat and with a face as white as the tablecloth, pointed to our portrait hanging on the wall. I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door, as Jeremy Lester left it, she explained. Of that followed, after this identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Mr. Cronson dropped off his chair into hysterics. Mr. Cronson, trembling like one of his age, attempted some kind of explanation, with Claire kept praying to be taken away, only to be taken away. I looked her away, not merely from Cronson Park. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. He's an old man now, finished Mr. Cronson, a man of over 80 who has confessed everything to me. You won't bring further sorrow and disgrace upon us by making this matter public. I promised him I would keep silence, but the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martingale. She married and is living in London, though I assure her there are no strange noises in my house. She will not visit me again. The little girl she wanted me so long ago to think of seriously is now my wife and the mother of my children.